Good evening, everyone. Like the excitement. Hi, everybody. My name is Radley Horton, and as a co-chair, I am thrilled to invite you all to our third convening of the Managed Retreat Conference. And have to say, looking around the room, how exciting it is to see folks in person after, of course, having to go remote in 2021. But this sort of harkens back to the spirit and the energy of 4 years ago when we first were able to convene together. So what I'm going to do first is about 5 minutes, knowing me, maybe a little bit longer, of opening remarks, setting the stage sort of for the conference as a whole. At that point, I'm going to turn it over to our welcome and remarks, two very important sets of welcoming and remarks. First from Sir Alex Halliday, representing the Columbia Climate School, and then to Tally, our New York City host, who's going to tell us about some of the great work New York City is doing in this space. But before we get into, and from there, I should say, we'll go directly into our evening plenary, our session chaired by Alex de Sherbinin on this topic of habitability. Okay, so before I go any further in my remarks, I want to take a moment to do a very important land acknowledgement. So to remind everyone that Columbia University recognizes these lands as part of the ancestral and traditional homeland of the Lenni Lenape and Wappinger people. And we are here tonight over the next 3 days in part to address the issues of exclusion, erasure, and systemic discrimination through our process with a commitment to equitable representation and to education in the broadest sort of two-way, if you will, sense of the word. So also, before going further with the remarks, that's sort of a where, but we also should talk a little bit about a when, I think. It's June 20th. When we convened 4 years ago, if you surveyed the audience, and said, what do you think of as sort of being around June 20th? Certainly I, and maybe some others, might first have thought of the summer solstice. But I think 4 years later, we think of Juneteenth now, first and foremost, having made some progress in that regard. But just to sort of quickly say what probably, most or all of us know at this point, Juneteenth is sometimes thought of as a second Independence Day. The Emancipation Proclamation was, of course, 1863, but it wasn't until June 19th, 1865, that in Texas we saw steps towards implementation of those decrees. So we do come to celebrate that, and while it's acknowledged more, while it's now a federal holiday, we need to acknowledge the legacies and continuations of racial injustice that remain ingrained in society, and frankly, inherently in topics like managed retreat, right? It's a central part of this conference and of this topic. So with that, let's now pivot a bit to talking about some of the specific other themes of this conference. So I went back and looked at sort of the opening remarks and sessions from 4 years ago to just kind of get a sense of where some of the focus has shifted and what some of the things are that remain the same. And I'll just be very quick in highlighting a couple things that jump out at me. First and foremost, obviously the need for action and for equitable research is greater than ever. Close to home, for those of us in the Northeast US in the past couple weeks, we've become aware of these huge fires burning not just in the Western US or Western Canada, but in the East in Quebec, and starting to experience here some of the effects of that severe smoke. This is something of a surprise to a lot of folks, and similarly, as we look more broadly around the world at the extent of this enormous heat wave, totally exceptional, that's been experienced in South Asia and Southeast Asia, and now sort of ominously looking at some of the surface ocean temperatures in many parts of the world right now. They can't fully be explained by the sort of emerging El Nino event, a pattern of natural variability that pushes temperatures higher, or by what you might call the kind of linear story of climate change, what climate models would tell us is plausible in terms of how high upper ocean temperatures could be at greenhouse gas concentrations where they are today. So these are sort of ominous, to say the least, sort of harbingers of the sort of unpredictability and sort of tipping points that we have to increasingly be concerned about. But of course, we don't have to just invoke these sort of surprises and tipping points. You know, as we think about the context of vulnerability and justice around the world, it's these gradual creeping changes. It's the storms that are totally predictable, the heat waves that climate models do really well, can sort of simulate really well, are already, of course, causing catastrophic impacts every day, especially for vulnerable populations around the world. Unfortunately, that hasn't changed, of course, relative to 4 years ago when we convened. And another thing, of course, is that we haven't made the necessary progress towards commitments towards reducing emissions, towards more boldly embracing and investing in adaptation, and towards justice and just development. So we're much closer to blowing past that 1.5 degree target than we were just 4 years ago when we convened, even as it's become clearer and clearer how catastrophic even 1.5 degrees will be. So these are clearly pessimistic messages, but we can also say, I think with a straight face, that the potential for sort of societal tipping points towards solutions and towards a more just society as a social species that can kind of leverage powerful dimensions of society also, I think, looks a little stronger than it did 4 years ago in that solution space. And I think that's going to be reflected as we look at the various themes in this conference, whether it's research sessions, research-focused sessions, or sessions focused on the nuts and bolts of implementation. Compared to 4 years ago, you're going to see much more presentations that invoke, a really deep research base, meta-analyses that talk about surveys of hundreds of people who've experienced buyouts, who've been engaged in retreat in a way that we sort of didn't have that much of a research base 4 years ago. You're going to see far more sessions focused on implementation in its various dimensions. More sessions focused on multi-jurisdictional approaches, an infinitely stronger federal presence than we had 4 years ago, just to name a few. This, of course, reflects broader societal shifts too. The most recent iterations of the National Climate Assessment, the IPCC report, are bringing examples and conversation and discussion of the challenges to the table around managed retreat in a way that previous iterations did not. So we're in this complicated place, right? It's these difficult messages which reflect so much of the broader sort of zeitgeist around the climate crisis generally. There is so much action around solutions. Communities are responding with creativity and determination on the ground, but it's just not at the required scale. So I think that, of course, leaves all of us in a position where we sometimes walk a fine line or struggle ourselves with feelings of optimism at times, feelings of pessimism at other times, with implications, for our research. So it is an emotionally charged topic. That was something we learned 4 years ago, and even the title, at what point managed retreat sort of reflects a microcosm of some of that. But what's exciting is over the next 3 days, we're going to engage around all these issues and hopefully take some more small steps towards progress on research and implementation fronts. So with that, I'll just quickly go through some of the logistics. We have over 50 sessions. Most of the time, there's going to be 4 sessions or so going simultaneously. So you're going to have a lot of difficult choices about which sessions to attend, of course, although everything's going to be recorded, so you can go back and watch other sessions later. But please also be on the lookout for some special sessions, including one that's tomorrow during the lunch hour, one that's at the end of the regular program tomorrow evening, I think starting at 5:30, and then one first thing Thursday morning at 8:30. And all the events are going to be here in Lerner Hall in various rooms and spaces within Lerner. We'll be serving light breakfast, lunch, and snacks, and coffee and other refreshments throughout the day. If you'd like to promote, whether you use Twitter or something else, at Columbia Climate is the climate school. And if you want to use hashtags, managed retreat is an obvious one, but of course there are many others that you all know and can suggest. So I want to give special thanks to Alex de Sherbinin, who is going to, as I said, lead the plenary soon. Nadia for all her great work supporting the conference, and for Adrian, who, as you know, is kind of the star who has made this happen. So we'll have a chance to give more thanks later, but those folks and then the steering committee as a whole who who made this possible and really sort of shepherded the process deserve special thanks now. But with that, I want to give special thanks to another person, Alex Halliday, who's been a champion for the kind of transdisciplinary work, work focused on implementation and these sort of diverse convenings on societal issues of critical importance. The fourth purpose, if you will, that gets us out of just focusing on research and into trying to have more of an impact in society through models such as co-production. So that's his vision of the climate school, which he has helped shape and to implement. And tangibly, specifically, he's been a champion for this conference from the very beginning, since his arrival in 2018, as a kind of exemplar for that goal for the climate school and for society. So we wanted to give special thanks to you, Alex, for all of your support. Okay, I'll try to read a bio pretty quickly. Sir Alex Halliday is the founding dean of Columbia's Climate School. He joined in 2018, and after spending more than a decade at the University of Oxford, during which time he was dean of science and engineering. With over 400 published research papers, he's been a pioneer in developing mass spectrometry to measure small isotopic variations in everything from meteorites to seawater to living organisms. And he's helped shed light on the birth and early development of our solar system, the interior workings of the Earth, and the processes that affect Earth's surface environment. His scientific achievements are far too many to mention. Just to mention one or two: the Murchison Medal of the Geological Society, Oxborough Medal of the Institute of Measurement and Control, and how about a knighthood for services to science and innovation. As a professor in Columbia's Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences, he divides his time between Columbia's Morningside campus and his isotope geochemistry lab at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. Please join me in a welcome of Alex Halliday at this time.
Thanks, Radley. This is so exciting for me because I've always been captivated by this idea of doing a conference on managed retreat. It was just an amazing term to start to use and recognize that this was going to be, in the future we're going to have departments of managed retreat. It's going to be such an important subject for the future, whether in universities or in government organizations or whatever. So let me start by welcoming you on behalf of the Columbia Climate School. It's the most exciting thing for me to actually see that we're having the third Managed Retreat conference. At the time of the second conference in June 2021, the Climate School had only just been established. It was the first newly launched school at Columbia in 25 years. And since then, we have already graduated 2 cohorts of amazing master's students doing transdisciplinary education in social sciences and natural sciences around the climate system. Schools represent the most powerful entities that we know of in universities for harnessing academic strength and focusing on really important subjects or groups of subjects. In American universities, the school is the thing that can really hire faculty, build resources, build new education programs, graduate students, and actually achieve a huge amount. The Columbia School of Public Health, the Mailman School of Public Health, is this year celebrating its 100th anniversary. So it's 100 years since it was formed, and it was formed in the aftermath of the 1918 flu pandemic, when it became very, very clear that health wasn't just about medicine and medical treatment. It had to be about understanding the environment under which illness took place and developed in cities in particular, like London or New York. And so it was a realization that this was going to be a subject that was going to be needed for the future if we were going to really tackle the major health issues of the planet. And today, that subject that we're thinking about for the future is climate. And it was realized that this was the greatest and most all-encompassing of challenges that lay before society. Whether you're in business, whether you're a community in a difficult situation, whether you are an academic, whether you're making a ton of money, whatever it is, climate change is going to be the big thing you're going to have to think about for the many decades coming. And we need to work fast. We need to actually train people in new and interesting ways to understand the complexity of this subject, and also to improve society's ability to cope with climate, to predict what's going to happen in the future, and to build resilience into our society. And this is particularly important from the point of view of what will happen in terms of issues that aren't just about building infrastructure, but actually moving people. And that's why this conference is so pertinent. The school's mission, the climate school's mission, written down, is to develop and inspire knowledge-based solutions and educate future leaders for just and prosperous societies on a healthy planet. And we've just been talking about how the world needs education on the side, and how we need diplomats who are going to need to understand climate in all countries of the world. People are going to actually have to understand what are the implications and how do we actually achieve negotiated settlements for how things have to be done differently in the future. This is going to be a huge part of what we have to do going forward. We currently, in the Climate School, have a Master's in Climate and Society. Like I said, we've graduated our second cohort now, just this May. It's a 12-month program, but we're expanding the numbers of students. There's increasing interest. There aren't that many degree programs with the word climate in it, and people are very, very excited about coming here to do this. But we're also developing other master's programs and a PhD program, which is on the horizon. And of course, a lot of this has to do with building key programs, exciting new opportunities in climate finance, in mitigation, in technology, and also understanding the human condition, ethics, and how we think about the story of climate and how people have to get used to it and think about it as part of their way of life. All of this is built upon Colombia's world-leading climate research. We have the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory here, which is huge and has been leading in climate research for many years. But also we have many other Earth Institute centers, over 20 of them, and we have many schools that also are engaged in this. In 2019, when we were considering whether to build a climate school, we went around all the schools and all the other parts of Colombia and just tried to do a survey of how many people we had. And we have close to 1,000 researchers at Columbia University working on climate, sustainability, and the environment. That's a hell of a workforce to put to, to get to work on a subject as important as this, and this is what we need to be doing. But the other reason why Columbia is so strong in this subject area is because universities are the right place to be doing this. They have a certain degree of people trust universities more than, dare I say, politicians in the UK. But they also trust, it's not that they trust academics, but academics bring together a certain depth of understanding, but also the breadth of the disciplines you need to tackle. So if you're thinking about sea level change, of course, you need people who understand satellite technology and how sea level is going to change with melting ice sheets, all the way through to people who understand the human rights issues that have to be faced with migration and mobility. And that's what you can get at a place like Columbia. You could do it in Harvard, you could do it in many other parts of the world as well. That's amazing strength that you get from working in university. But the thing you don't get in the university as well is the engagement of what it feels like, or what you experience in a community that is really suffering from the effects of climate change. We get a bit of that in New York City, but in many parts of the world, particularly the tropics, of course, but also actually areas like Alaska, we know that the effects of climate change are already painful and actually disrupting communities, disrupting ways of life, and actually building the resilience for the future is massively important. So rather, like it's been said already, education has got to be a two-way process. The academics at Columbia aren't going to be the people who are going to come up with all the magical solutions. We have to work together with communities who actually do understand what to do better than many academics do, and build this understanding and these subject areas as a partnership rather than something that you do just on your own. The Managed Retreat Conference emerged from the Earth Institute's Adaptation Initiative, which was already going when I arrived here in 2018. In fact, it was winding up. And it was led by Radley Horton, who you just heard from, and Lisa Goddard, who was the former director of the International Research Institute for Climate and Society, one of our main climate adaptation organizations, who sadly passed away in 2022 from cancer. In 2018, Radley partnered with Alex de Sherbinin, the director of the Climate School's Climate Mobility Network, to develop this highly successful series of events. And when I realized what was happening, I'd only just arrived, I said, we've got to do this on a regular basis. This is such an important thing. We've got to build a community of people working in this space. The first Managed Retreat Conference in 2019 hosted 400 attendees and featured 150 speakers in 30 sessions over 3 days. In 2021, because of the pandemic, we went virtual, and this greatly expanded our reach. For that conference, we had 850 attendees, 850, with 270 speakers in 53 sessions over 4 days, all conducted online. Pretty much all of these sessions are available on YouTube for public viewing. At this conference, we now have 450 people in person, with another 125 attending online. Over 4 days, we will hear from nearly 220 speakers in 51 sessions. So you should be pretty, pretty full of stuff by the time you finish. The theme of the first conference, for those of you who weren't there, was resilience building in the coastal zone. So it was very much a focus on what do we have to think about with sea level change in particular and extreme events. But it became very clear that actually Managed Retreat wasn't just going to be about the coastal zone, and we're going to have to think about other aspects of this. The second was resilience, relocation, and climate justice. And this year's theme is habitability and mobility in the era of climate change. Throughout each of the conferences, issues of environmental and climate justice have been woven through the programs. Our opening plenary panel, coming up in a few minutes, will explore issues of habitability, loss and damage, and climate justice. We've also seen a broadening of participation from outside the United States in this particular subject area and this conference, as well as in topical areas related to concerns around climate and mobility in low and middle income countries. So before we get underway and before closing, I'd like to announce the establishment of the Climate Mobility Knowledge Hub, which is a partnership between the Climate School and the Global Center for Climate Mobility, GCCM, under the umbrella of the United Nations, and working in close collaboration with the International Organization for Migration, the World Bank, the UN agencies, and regional partners such as the African Union and the Association for Caribbean States. Since 2020, the Climate School's Center for International Earth Science Information Network, or CIESIN, which Alex de Sherbinin is part of, has been supporting the work of the GCCM by undertaking climate mobility modeling for regional initiatives in Africa and the Caribbean. The time has come to elevate this work as an initiative that spans the entire Climate School, with programs such as Global Knowledge Forum on Climate Mobility, a climate literacy program, and continuing efforts to advance the use of climate mobility data and models for decision making. So the Climate School is totally committed to this subject area, very keen to do more and keen to expand upon what we've been doing already. I'd like to acknowledge that GCCM's Managing Director, Kamal Amakrane, is here. Please stand up, Kamal. And his Chief Scientific Advisor, Sarah Rosengartner. Sarah, stand up. And Alex de Sherbinin, who's here as well, who you know, and they are all jointly working to fulfill the vision of this new knowledge hub. So please, I'm sure they'll have lots to say to you, starting right away. And with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for coming. It's wonderful to see you all gathered in this way. I'm going to pass the floor back to Radley, but I wish you all a wonderful week of fantastic discussion and stimulating conversations and lectures. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Great. All right. Before we turn it over to Alex for our panel, I have the pleasure and privilege of introducing Burley, Senior Policy Advisor on the Resilient and Efficient Buildings team at the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. Her work focuses on buildings level policy with a focus on housing to ensure New Yorkers have access to affordable financial resources like flood insurance to help make homes more sustainable and resilient. She's currently working on the development of the city's housing, mobility, and land acquisition program announced this April in Plan YC, Getting Sustainability Done, consistent with some of these conference themes. She previously worked for the New York City Mayor's Office of Housing Recovery Operations, Build It Back, identifying solutions to support flood damaged properties in the city's dense urban environment. Her professional experience brings together communication, policy, and land use planning in flood-prone communities. She holds a BA in political science from American University and a master's in urban planning from NYU. Please welcome Tally.
I think you guys can all kind of see me, so I'm a little bit on the short side. Good evening and welcome to everyone. It's nice to see some familiar faces. It's nice to welcome some of you to New York City for the first time. The Managed Retreat Conference is an important opportunity that brings together researchers, activists, and government practitioners from across the globe to discuss one of the most complex and challenging issues we face in a changing climate. The work that my office does and my colleagues do focuses on climate resiliency and sustainability and its impacts, including its impacts to the city's housing. As we all know, climate change is not a future problem. We see and hear about it in the news. We experience the impacts every day on our homes, businesses, and lives. In New York City, we've seen firsthand during Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Ida, during each and every heat wave, and just the other week when smoke descended on the city due to the Canadian wildfires and impacted our air quality. But it's clear, and we all know, that the impacts of climate change do not affect everyone equally. That's why my office's work is rooted in environmental justice principles. We believe that all New Yorkers should live, learn, work, and play in a safe, healthy, resilient, and sustainable environment. The work that we do as a city often focuses on carbon emissions and building electrification, but we also look closely at how the location, quality, and affordability of our housing stock can disproportionately make some individuals more vulnerable to climate impacts. New York City, in particular, has long had a tight, high-cost housing market. But as heat waves become more prevalent and flooding more widespread, not only will housing costs be impacted, but it will grow increasingly necessary to make changes to our homes to ensure that our residents can continue to live comfortably and affordably in our city. When we discuss managed retreat, many of our brains turn, rightfully so, to rising sea levels and coastal neighborhoods. But I want to take a moment to acknowledge the fact that extreme heat and precipitation will also drive countless New Yorkers and people across the globe to make decisions and changes in their lives. Extreme heat in New York City kills 400 New Yorkers each year, predominantly impacting brown, Black, and elderly residents. Housing costs are inherently tied to energy costs and energy insecurity. Around 500,000 low-income New York City families are considered energy cost burdened. And so, as our city becomes hotter, we must consider not only how to address the buildings to make them safer and cooler, but how to address rising energy costs as well. Similarly, as we all know, flooding is also closely related to our city's housing stability. With the growing intensity and frequency of flood events, both in coastal neighborhoods and inland areas of our city, many of our residents are already facing repeated flooding that causes financial damages and puts lives at risk. Even a little bit of flooding can cause significant damage. That cost is particularly concerning given that the average American household does not have $400 in savings. If flood damages are left unaddressed, it can lead to building decay, it can impact the health of the household, especially when hazards like mold are present, and it can lead to neighborhood blight. Unfortunately, many of the financial resources that are available to address flood damages households often have to pay for them out of pocket. Businesses and owners often fall behind on spending and have to postpone necessary work. Climate change will only exacerbate these financial shocks and stressors. The work that MOCEJ focuses on as it relates to flooding focuses on it from multiple levels. We look at the neighborhood, we look at the block, we look at the household, and we look at the building. In partnership with the Center for New York City Neighborhoods, we conduct outreach and education through Flood Help NY. This important resource provides information to residents about their flood risks, deepens their understanding about the importance of flood insurance, and it provides important information about building level resiliency measures that can reduce flood damages and costs. We also advocate for reforms at the state level, like flood risk disclosure, which we were excited to pass the New York State Legislature earlier this month, thanks in part to the ongoing advocacy of organizations like the Waterfront Alliance. And it's why we continue to advocate for reforms to the National Flood Insurance Program, because it is the single best financial tool available for our residents, and we want to make sure it remains affordable for all. Additionally, we explore new and innovative financial products like parametric insurance. We hope that this can be an additional tool in our toolbox that can complement NFIP and get money into residents' hands faster after a flood. But even with innovative tools, even with improved disclosure, affordable flood insurance, we know that due to a changing climate, many of our residents are going to have to make tough decisions and consider relocating. Our primary goal as New York City is to prevent long-term displacement caused by flooding and to provide New York City residents in flood-prone areas with the resources that they need to prepare for a future move. I want to acknowledge that the decision to move after generations in a home and a community is a deeply personal one, and the housing costs in a city like New York only make that decision more difficult. But again, this is not a future problem. We know in New York City that many of our communities are already experiencing chronic and repeated flooding. They already live their lives by the tide cycle and the weather forecast, and they're already having difficult decisions at their dinner table about when and how to move to a less flood vulnerable area. That is why in our climate plan, Plan YC, Getting Sustainability Done, which we released in April of this year, we announced that New York City will launch a permanent blue sky, voluntary housing mobility land acquisition program by 2025. Leveraging state and federal funding and after a robust community engagement process, this voluntary program will allow residents in high-risk areas to sell their homes to the city. Land acquired through the program will then be converted to resilient and sustainable end uses like natural open space, wetlands, blue belts, and meet the community's needs and help reduce flooding in neighboring areas. Most importantly, the city hopes that this program will take a human-centered approach to residential buyouts. We want to build on lessons from the New York City Build It Back program and from best practices in other buyout programs across the country, focusing not only on land acquisition, but on financial resilience. Migration is not a new concept. For centuries, people have migrated to create better lives, to find new opportunities. They have fled famine, destruction, inequality, and war. And while we don't have a clear sense of what climate migration will look like at scale in New York City or across the globe, there is no question that the climate crisis is changing our relationship with our communities, our neighborhoods, and our homes. The Managed Retreat Conference offers an important opportunity for us to all learn. Innovation and creativity are central to building an equitable, environmentally just, and resilient and sustainable future. But those things do not happen independently or in a silo. They are built through collaboration, through partnership, and open-mindedness across sectors, industries, and governments. No one of us has all of the solutions or all of the answers. And so as the city begins implementing policies articulated in Plan YC and shaping programs like the Housing Mobility and Land Acquisition Program, the Managed Retreat Conference serves as an opportunity for us as government practitioners to continue to learn and collaborate and identify creative solutions that can build a resilient and sustainable future for all New Yorkers. I want to thank the Columbia Climate School for hosting this conference, and I want to thank all of you for attending. Have a wonderful next few days discussing, learning, and collaborating.
So greetings, everyone. My name is Alex Sherbinin, and I also just want to give a special welcome to those online. We have over 100 people who are registered online, and so we hope that many of those are able to pose questions during after we do the panel. We're now turning to the panel portion of our session. As Radley mentioned, I co-chair the conference with him. I also serve as Deputy Director of CIESIN, a data and research center at the Climate School, and I'm a co-director, as Alex mentioned, of the Climate Mobility Network, which is one of the kind of organizing groups that's behind this conference. Kamal Amakrane is the other co-director of that mobility network, so we're delighted to have him here today. So before we go to the panel, I have a couple announcements. One, I just want to acknowledge that today is World Refugee Day. If you didn't know that, it's a day where we kind of acknowledge the fact that there's 37 million refugees in the world now. That's equivalent to the population of Canada. Many of those refugees are living in really deplorable situations, and some over prolonged periods of time. So it's a particular crisis that we want to acknowledge and just put a stake in the ground. I think today's panel will be speaking to some of the issues that relate to that. Secondly, I'd like to announce some opportunities to publish your work if you're interested. One is there's a special issue of that just launched today, actually, in Frontiers in Climate, which is a research topic on addressing climate risks in refugee settings. Jamin Vandenhoek, who's here at the conference, in fact, he's up here at one of the front tables, is going to be guest editing that, and we're excited to see what kind of papers get submitted to that special issue. A second opportunity is and this is open to any of you if you'd like. I'm the chief editor of Frontiers in Climate's Climate Mobility section, and we have the opportunity to organize a special issue or research topic on the topic of managed retreat. So it would be a relatively easy ask, because we would be going to every member and every presenter at this conference and saying, essentially, do you want to work your paper into something that's a little bit more than a conference paper, maybe something like a full-length journal article? So if you're interested in that opportunity, please reach out to me through the Whova app. You can find me, you just search for my first name. My last name is a bit difficult, but you could search for Alex and you'll find me. So finally, I just wanted to mention that the Population Environment Research Network, which I am the co-coordinator of with Susanna Adamo at CIESIN. We run it at CIESIN, but it's sponsored by Future Earth and also the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population, held in March a cyber seminar during which we explored the concept of habitability in population environment studies. We organized that online seminar in conjunction with the Habitable Project, which is an EU-funded project that is led by the Hugo Center at University of Liège. And we'll be continuing that discussion on habitability in two sessions, one both before lunch and after lunch on Thursday. So the 10:30 session and the I think it's 10:30 and 1 p.m. session or something like that. We'll be focusing on habitability. So if you're interested in exploring these issues more, please come to those sessions and join us as we discuss these issues in more depth. So turning to today's panel, the idea behind focusing on the topic of habitability and loss and damage, climate justice and mobility in the opening plenary was to expose some of the participants here who may be coming from a more US-based or developed country context to the broader international dialogues around climate mobility. One of our distinguished panelists, Jola Ajibade, has written eloquently in the pages of Global Environmental Change on why climate migration is not managed retreat. While the primary focus of this conference will be and is managed retreat, which can be understood kind of as a technical package in a way of incentives and government programs that help to protect people who are in harm's way, particularly in coastal zone, we felt it would be beneficial to broaden the focus a bit, at least for this year's conference, to the issues confronting many low and middle income countries in relation to climate displacement, migration, and resettlement, as well as the growing risk of involuntary immobility, meaning people who are trapped by climate impacts on the one hand and poverty on the other. So for our climate mobility network, we use this diagram. I don't know if this pointer is going to work. Maybe, there we go. Where managed retreat is situated kind of in the middle here as one response to repeated climate hazards and disasters that occur, along with resettlement, maybe in more low income settings. And there are other forms of mobility, however, and also issues such as involuntary immobility that are prevalent in many parts of the developing world and which relate to different types of climate triggers. And then we have a kind of panoply of different responses here on the right-hand side. So we're delighted that we have three highly distinguished panelists tonight, who I will now introduce in turn to get our discussion started on the topic of habitability, loss and damage, climate justice, and mobility. And you are encouraged to learn more about them on the Whova app. But right now, I'll just call up, and then as each of them presents, I'll read out portions of their bios so that you know more about them. David Wrathall, if you'd come on up, and then Jola Ajibade, and Kamal Amakrane, if you would all come up. And then I will start, as they get situated here, to read David Wrathall's bio. He will be starting us off with a discussion on habitability. So David is a longtime fellow traveler in the climate migration space. He is an associate professor of natural hazards at Oregon State University's College of Earth and Ocean and Atmospheric Sciences, and a lead author of the IPCC's Sixth Assessment Report, Chapter 8 on Poverty, Livelihoods, and Sustainable Development. He also coordinated the group of IPCC authors contributing to the cross-chapter treatment of migration, displacement, and mobility. David studies the ways that climate change impacts are threatening people's livelihoods and rendering parts of the world uninhabitable, thus driving new patterns of human migration. He has examined human migration in response to various climate hazards, including sea level rise, tropical weather extremes, glacier recession, drought, and ocean acidification. David also studies other wicked environmental problems, including the relationship between climate change, violent conflict, narco-trafficking, and human displacement, especially in Central America. During today's panel, David will be focusing on the topic of habitability. So David, come on up, and we look forward to hearing from you. Let's give him a round of applause, please. Take this with me. I'm going to forward this. So these are the panelists, and
hello, thank you so much, Alex, for the kind introduction. Thank you to my co-panelists. Thanks to the organizers. I want to tell you a difficult story about habitability and then try to make sense of it with you. So the story of habitability and migration begins for me in the year 2005, when I was working as a Peace Corps volunteer in the city of La Ceiba, Honduras, the principal city on the north coast there. I was working on a housing project with Habitat for Humanity, and I learned about a regular pattern of catastrophic flooding that was occurring across a string of villages along the north coast. Of about 50 villages that shared similar characteristics, 8 of them had experienced a very similar phenomenon. The densely populated village center was permanently destroyed by a deadly combination of river flooding and storm surges, and the coastal villages were becoming uninhabitable, they said, the people told me, and the result was migration to the city where I lived. So in 2007, I began a PhD on this topic, migration amidst shifting habitability. Okay, so despite working on these topics for 15 years, I coordinated the IPCC's Sixth Assessment's treatment of migration and habitability. I run a lab called the Habitability Lab at Oregon State, and I'm still perplexed by the topic. And I want to relate the experience of an interviewee from this case study, from my dissertation, that has stayed with me and really let's try to make some sense of it. So we'll call this interviewee Florinda. So she was an 82-year-old Garifuna woman from Santa Rosa de Aguan who lived square in the middle of a neighborhood that was completely destroyed by Hurricane Mitch. So this house that you would have seen here was 3 streets away from the coast prior to this storm. She was a member of a proud generation of Garifuna people who had built a prosperous city on the Caribbean coast. Santa Rosa was the capital of Garifuna culture. Her generation had built a beautiful city with around a bustling fishing economy. They opened hotels and restaurants. Where people would congregate and play music and dance. They planted gardens. They raised happy children. And then in October 1998, Hurricane Mitch, a Category 5 storm, brewed over the Caribbean and made landfall in Honduras. It paused over the Aguan Valley in northern Honduras, where it dumped 2 vertical meters of water in a space of 72 hours. The flood hit Santa Rosa in the middle of the night, and despite evacuation efforts, 30 villagers perished. So in the morning, this is the report that Florinda gave to me. She approached the shore. Her home, her store, her neighborhood was now open ocean. Every trace of it was gone. Members of her family had died during the night, and everything she knew was gone. The basis for every memory, the cluster of homes where she was raised, and in turn where she had raised her own children. The location and context for all of her experiences, the material basis for her own identity, and the understanding of herself, the resting place of the souls of her ancestors, the totality of her life was gone. In Garifuna cosmology, the soul is loosely connected to the body, and life events can cause the soul to wander. And so that morning, this is the story that Florinda tells me. She goes to the beach to survey what had happened, and she said that her soul left her body. And she could hear her soul calling to her from the open ocean. And she sat on the beach for 3 days crying for her soul to return. And after 3 days of sitting on the beach, her soul did return to her, but it was different. And from that day, she lived with a strange soul. A strange soul. So imagine I'm a PhD student with training in social ecological systems and livelihood, sustainable livelihood approaches. How am I supposed to comprehend this? How do we understand human experiences this profound that may replicate millions and millions of times over the coming century? The conceptual frameworks are lacking. The tools and formulas, they feel profane. The data don't capture what is actually happening, what is elemental about human safety, belonging, and the meaning of place. So as perplexed as I was, I continue to be, and I want to identify some helpful ideas and frameworks that I hope we can discuss this week, that we can discuss as a panel. The first is an understanding of complex systems or social ecological systems. We can think about habitability as a state of a system. A system can flip back and forth between habitable and uninhabitable states. And in my view, when migration occurs, this is a signal of that flipping happening. We can apply tools from climate change adaptation, which imagines impacts of climate change that would occur as we arrive at limits and barriers to adaptation, or the soft and hard limits to adaptation as we think about them in the IPCC. So this is related to discussions on loss and damage. So which losses drive changes in habitability? In an article that I wrote with Alex, with Radley Horton, and with Michael Oppenheimer, we identified 3 losses that become very important. The first is physical safety, including housing and food, and psychological safety, which is accompanying. The second is the loss of sustainable livelihoods. The third is the capacity to manage environmental risks. And when any or all of these losses occur, we can expect habitability to be at risk. So the second of these, livelihoods. Livelihoods are uniquely important from the migration studies perspective. We know that when people can't earn a living in a place, then they can't really live there. So aside from the simple act of making a living, the livelihoods perspective gives us something very important, and that is a notion of subjectivity and of agency. Habitability depends on a subjective determination that this place is habitable, and that people have agency to act. So these determinations about habitability are subjective, but they're also intersubjective, that these determinations are shared among people based on kinship and relationships of care. So lastly, the last framework, it's sort of the rejection of a framework. We know enough now to reject environmental deterministic visions of habitability. The vulnerability of human settlements is socially constructed through history, with political economies that have played a role in shaping places as they exist now and as they can continue to exist into the future. Different people have different degrees of power to make determinations about habitability. We ought to ask questions: for whom are places habitable, and to whom do they become inhabitable? So I have questions to conclude here. I have questions. We are already committed to a certain degree of climate change, and even as the margins of our world become less habitable, we can imagine the rest of this planet being far more habitable for everyone else. Are we a species that protects, that includes? Can we grieve losses, and can we be capable of compassion? I think the century ahead of climate change is going to answer some of these questions for us. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And I'm now going to introduce Jola Ajibade, who is an associate professor at Portland State University and a scholar activist who applies both environmental justice and political ecology lenses to study the intersections of climate risk, urban disasters, resilience planning, coastal management, and societal transformations. In her research, she examines how climate adaptation solutions, such as managed retreat programs, floating cities, tree planting, blue-green infrastructures, and utopian development projects intertwine with exclusionary planning practices to reproduce structural and historical injustices, thereby exacerbating racial, gender, and class-based inequalities. These injustices, in turn, undermine the capacities of marginalized communities to respond to climatic and socioeconomic crises. Her work has been featured in many academic journals and media outlets such as Science Friday, NPR, Yale Environment 360, Science, and Vice. And I also wanted to mention that Jola mentioned to us that actually her exposure to managed retreat in 2019 and at this conference back in that year was instrumental in kind of getting her in a particular area of research, making her realize that there are actually more people than just in her department at Portland State that are actually interested in these topics. So we're delighted that she's here today to present in the plenary. She'll be presenting on and focusing on climate justice and mobility. Over to you, Jola.
Thank you, everyone. It's an honor and at the same time a privilege to be standing before you all, especially many of you are my colleagues, friends, and just people that I really admire. So thank you for being here. I want to thank the organizers of today's event, and I want to thank everyone who spoke before me, my co-panelists as well. So when I was asked to participate in this, is this a clicker? This way? Okay, perfect. So to participate in this panel, one of the issues that I was thinking about, what exactly was I going to talk about? Because you're all the researchers, you do, many of you do this work, and you probably know some of this issue well, way more than I do. So what I'm going to share with you today are things that I've been reflecting on sort of from my own lived experience and the issues that have changed my life, that I think the work that we need to do to also change the lives of people out there. So for many of us that are in this room, our story is only possible because our capabilities have not been stifled. We're not here because we have inheritances, the right skin color, the right gender, the right nationality, the right abilities, the right looks, etc. The system globally and locally, quite frankly, was not designed for us. the zoning laws, the housing loans, the healthcare system, the land policies were all designed as systems of marginalization and oppression that mostly benefited a few. But we fought against all odds to be where we are today. And to be here is indeed a testament to the change that can happen to people when their capabilities are enhanced. We're here because our capabilities have been enhanced and we can pursue our respective desires and goals. Our ancestors fought against slavery and racism and colonialism, Western imperialism, gender inequality, sexism, and bigotry. We stand today on the shoulders and legacies of great men and women who paid the ultimate price with their lives so we can enjoy the liberty and freedom that we have today. Many of us in this room, we do care about justice issue. I know a lot of you do. And you care about equity issues, even in the context of climate mobilities. But like Radley said earlier, we're also celebrating Juneteenth, which happened just yesterday. Many of us were celebrating that. But that's also a period of great transformation. And we're at a point in human history where we do need another great transformation. We need to think about our brothers and sisters, and quite frankly, fellow humans, for whom freedom to lead the kinds of basic lives or even perhaps more enriching and thriving lives have become very much difficult and unachievable. We must remember those who live under a new form of bondage that has been unleashed by climate change and its devastating impacts. So I'm going to show you a couple of pictures that, oh, yes, I apologize for that. Let me go back here. Can you just, I need to press this in? Okay, what do I do? All right. So while they are resetting for slideshow, I just want to remind us about what is going on in the other parts of the world where some of you already know that. Can I go forward now? Perfect. Slowly. All right. Thank you. Yeah, this is the image I want to show us first. And this image, quite frankly, requires us to think about multiple justice scenarios that will be needed if we want the kind of transformation in this context of what we'll be exploring today. First, if we go back here, again, I'm sorry, I'm not getting this right. Anyways, we'll see if you can figure it out. But one of the key things I want to remind people is about a 2022 Pakistani flood that displaced more than 33 million people. I believe a talk will be given during this conference about that. But I just want to remind people about the damages that has happened during that flood, the crops and livelihoods of people that were destroyed, infrastructure that were destroyed, but also the country's healthcare system and education system and the agricultural system were devastated during that period. And similarly, many of you may know about the Nigerian flooding that happened right after the Pakistani situation. Nigeria also experienced a major flooding where more than 1.4 million people were displaced. And in that context, 600 people died. 2,400 people were also injured, and more than 80,000 homes were destroyed. And this happened across about 6 states in Nigeria, and so close to $30 billion of infrastructure was destroyed. But if you look at this image, I think of this lady and the daughter moving in the water. That could have been me. It could have been many of us. And right now, if you think about if there are no resources to support them, to kind of transform their lives, they may never get to where they need to be in terms of their capability being achieved. So that's one thing for us to think about. But another issue that I think is also important is the fact that multiple exposures to extreme events can also reduce, or quite frankly, is reducing life expectancy in the developing world. If you think about issues around food insecurity and malnutrition that has been exacerbated by climate change, you think about water scarcity issues, heat-related illnesses, spread of infectious diseases, including exposure to air pollution, all of these issues are contributing to reduce life expectancy for many communities in America, but also many communities in the global South. And a key thing we need to think about is, as a collective, a collection of scholars and practitioners and government and students, what do we need to do to really center a world that is truly based on justice? What do we need to do in terms of changing financing, changing institutions, changing or creating a care ethic that can allow us to move forward in the ways in which we are responding to impact of climate change? What kinds of governance structures do we really need? Or can we think about the existing structures we have now, even the UN system, the IMO, the UNHCR, the FEMA, the ORD, all of the institutions that we look onto, are they truly able to respond to the 21st century challenges that we face? Do they need to change? Do they need to transform? And that's something we need to think about collectively. And particularly, I want to center, I'll be wrapping up very soon. I have just 5 agendas that I've been thinking about, and I hope that you can join me in also thinking about how do we advance these different agendas, one of which many of you are already working on, the issue of climate justice, right? So I believe that society's success or failure on issues of climate justice will be determined by, will be measured by how well we're supporting and protecting and being able to respond to the needs of frontline communities that are experiencing the impact of climate change. But that's one issue. The second issue is also the existing structural inequalities in housing, in land, in food, in health, in livelihood are already being worsened by climate change. We need to find ways to respond to that. Our failure to respond to those issues also means, for me, a failure on climate justice issues. Another issue that I mentioned earlier is the issue of capability, the ability to do and to be who you want to be. That is already being taken away from many people because of the impact of climate change and because social institutions and political institutions are failing communities. How can we make sure that we can center capability justice in the ways in which we're thinking about climate change, in the ways in which we're responding and in thinking about adaptation in response to the impact of climate change? Another issue that I think many of you would perhaps already been thinking about or working with groups on is the issue of loss and damage, which obviously was mentioned at the COP meeting, the United Nations Conference of Party Meetings, in Egypt last year. And in that meeting, everybody was celebrating this advancement on loss and damage funding, which I think is important. But I think many of us can also influence the kinds of issues that could be centered when we're thinking about loss and damage. For me, there are key issues that I think we must push for in the context of expanding the funding. One of which is that we need to make sure that loss and damage funding must fund communities that choose to stay in situ if they want to, or that those who want to move, that loss and damage funding should also support relocation of people who want to move to much more habitable areas. Another issue is the loss and damage funding should also be directed to support communities that are in trapped situations so that we don't have an expansion of humanitarian crisis. Loss and damage funding must also support communities that have situations where their capabilities have been undermined. And by that, I mean loss and damage funding should be directed to support institutions in creating better schools for people, better hospitals, better healthcare systems. So it cannot just be a funding for building or rebuilding housing alone. It has to be a holistic set of funding that actually addresses ecosystem damages, losses of lives, losses of livelihoods, but also losses of capabilities must be centered in the ways in which we think about loss and damage support. And I also believe that we need to hold corporations accountable for loss and damage funding. It shouldn't only be about bilateral donor relationship or multilateral donor relationship. We need to begin to lobby our government across the world to ensure that the big emitters contribute to the portfolio that goes to support people in the context of loss and damage. So those are some of the things I wanted to put out there. And a fourth thing there is the issue about transformative policy futures. We need new policies. A lot of the policies on adaptation and mitigation, many of them do not necessarily center justice. And so in thinking about whether we're thinking about capability issues, climate justice issues, or loss and damage issues, those are issues that I think can come together in ways we are thinking about a new sets of policy. Obviously, there has to be at multiple levels, new sets of policies that can really support people in their adaptation efforts for those who are willing to move, move, for those who are trapped, for those who are willing to stay in situ and to embrace all kinds of adaptation approaches that would enhance their capability in their own context. And more importantly, another thing that I think is important, some of you are perhaps working on this issue already, is the issue of receiving orbs. There are people working on receiving cities and lobbying governments in different countries, and particularly here in America. I have a couple of colleagues already lobbying local government to ensure that they build infrastructure, they build resilience orbs, they build roads and housing that can really support new people that are coming in. But we need to think about cultural adaptation for people as well, where they can connect to new families, where they can build new forms of rootedness in those regions where they choose to relocate to. And so beyond the idea of receiving cities, we need to think about receiving hubs within those cities, but also regional hubs that can actually enhance and attract people who want to move there. So those are a few of the things that I've been thinking about. And I think in all of these policies, centering justice across the board through loss and damage, through capability ideas, and through receiving hubs will be important as we move forward in our conversation on what needs to happen on habitability, climate mobilities, and climate justice. Thank you, and excited to have your questions later.
Thank you, Jola, for your really inspiring remarks. So last but not least, we're going to have Kamal Amakrane speak. He currently leads the Global Center for Climate Mobility, advancing various regional climate mobility initiatives enabled by the UN, about which we heard earlier from Alex Halliday. He also spearheads the Rising Nations Initiative, a UN member states-led effort focused on protecting the statehood, sovereignty, and heritage of Pacific Atoll island countries facing existential threats from rising sea level. Kamal has been a faculty member at Columbia University since 2018, where he co-directs with me the university's Climate Mobility Network and works on advancing efforts to address climate forced migration. In 2018, he directed the Migration Consensus Initiative as part of Columbia's Global Policy Initiative. During the intergovernmental negotiations for the Global Compact on Migration, or for migration, he successfully led a coalition that pressed for countries to recognize the need to protect those forced to leave for their countries due to climate change, as well as for commitments to address climate forced migration. Prior to this, Kamal had a distinguished career working in the UN, serving as political director to successive presidents of the UN General Assembly, Chief of Staff of the UN Peacekeeping Mission in Côte d'Ivoire, and head of the UN-AU Joint Peacekeeping Mission for Darfur, among many other roles. During today's panel, Kamal will be discussing loss and damage in the context of climate mobility. With that, Kamal, did you want to stand here or wherever you want to be? Okay, choose your position.
Good afternoon, all. Thank you, Alex, for having me today. Thank you for the organizers for putting together this conference. I want to go back to my first assignment when I started in the UN over 20 plus years ago. I was asked to be the research person for a speech that Kofi Annan, and this is right after 9/11, was going to give to the Security Council on the relationship between justice and peace. And the whole idea was, as we press for peace, agreement, pre-settlement, and we try to build a better future for our future generations, what was the obligation and what needed to be done in order to also address the justice dimension of existing suffering and existing communities. And it was a quite difficult conversation because it's pretty much where do you put justice vis-a-vis peace and peace vis-a-vis justice. And somehow, and this is his credit, he was able to frame it in an interesting sentence, and then pretty much turned to the Security Council to decide how they want to proceed. And he said, and I quote in his speech, peace is justice for future communities and future people. But justice, it's also peace for current and past people. And the idea is that at one point, there is a continuum in time, and we have to decide whether we focus on tomorrow or we focus on yesterday. Why did I start with this, this note? Because this brings me back on how do we look at loss and damage, and the current contradiction in the political space on loss and damage, particularly in the context of climate negotiations. As you know very well, there is a group of people or a group of countries, negotiators, that look at loss and damage primarily from a compensation point of view, a climate justice point of view, and are primarily focused on ensuring that debt has to be paid by the polluters. And as you know very well, politicians and negotiators cannot admit any guilt and do not stand ready to excuse for the industrialization, the growth, or the development of their own nations. And this regrettably left the negotiations at a standstill for close to 20 years, where Pacific countries in early the 90s and early 2000 were pressing for these issues. Now, things have evolved, but there is still no consensus on where to go forward on loss and damage. Last COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, we were primarily able, with the group of some 37 countries, to include in the definition of loss and damage forced displacement, human mobility, and loss of heritage. However, there is still a conversation, as I mentioned, whether this is a prevention exercise or is it a compensation exercise? Because you can go through the entire document and no one is talking about the past, particularly compensation. And when you talk about the establishment of a loss and damage fund, the conversation has only started on or let me put it in technocratic words, what are the criteria to have access to the funds and who should be eligible to have access to these funds? Why this is relevant and necessary? Because I think this is where the science and the university community is important, as it was mentioned earlier, on setting up the definitions of what is loss and damage, setting up a definitions of what is adaptation and what is the nexus between adaptation and loss and damage. As of today, there is no definition of adaptation. And until last COP, when countries tried to approach the Green Fund to seek funding and support for projects relevant to forced displacement, managed retreat, and etc., the Green Fund will return, but migration has not been defined as adaptation, and there is no definition actually to support your ask and your request when it comes to funding. We hope that at least we will see in the next years progress in three specific spaces. And one is politics, second is people, and third is policies. So these are the three Ps. What do you take from the COP processes? As you may have seen, for those who have been at Bonn, there is very little progress on politics. Politics of definitions, politics of criteria, politics of responsibility, and politics of politicking, literally. Who sits at the table, who should be included, who has the right to speak, and which story is to be told. And this is where tremendous work has to be done in order to make the politics of climate, the politics of loss and damage, the politics of action inclusive, pluralist, but most importantly, specific. And here, it is very regrettable that the space of climate, particularly the nexus between loss and damage and climate action, it's being primarily looked through from a global lenses. And I still remember when I first mentioned to my grandmother that we need to protect the planet and we need to ensure that we do not cross the 1.5 Celsius degree. She was like, it's okay, you just open the window. And it's this failure of all of us in communicating, in ensuring that there is at least a minimum literacy level among affected population, among politicians, among policymakers on what does it mean and what are the nexuses and what are the connections between these aspects. On politics also is very important to note that while we all push for a global agenda, that the action and the response is local. And here on the politics, I can tell you, we discuss in Managed Retreat in the context of people that are going to move to another state, are going to be supported or enabled to move to safety inland. What do you do with the countries that are going to lose everything? That's the ultimate loss and damage. What do you do with countries that are going to disappear as a result of sea level rise? And I'm not discussing 2100, I'm discussing the next 15 years. Literally, 3 countries are going to become inhabitable in front of our eyes. What is going to happen to the future of sovereignty? What is the future of democracy? What is the future of the United Nations? What is the future of citizenship? These conversations have not started yet. Last but not least, on politics, it's pretty much the financial dimension of politics. Are we going to focus on compensation? And then the conversation can last for another 2 to 3 decades. You all remember that the commitment to $1 billion was close to 13 years ago. And I think by today's inflation, it's literally close to $30 billion in 29 or 28. And as we go forward, and by the time the $100 billion are on the table, it will have the value of $1 billion of when they have decided. So do we focus on the past? Do we focus on the future? Do we emphasize prevention, or we do pinpointing? I have no issues, but a decision has to be taken. And I take here just from my own experience as a peacekeeper, we spend tremendous funds and treasure in doing peacekeeping. Troops on the ground, troops deployed, tons of instruments. But why we did that? Because it was easy to respond to a crisis that had already happened. It's only down the stream, I think close to 2020, that people start to realize, guess what? It's worth investing in prevention. It's worth investing in social cohesion. It's worth investing in peace continuity and peace building. And this is going to be at the key of loss and damage. Because, and this brings me to the second point on policy, we have now instruments to anticipate the population that is going to be impacted and affected. We have capacity to project informed planning, and as such, we should be able and we should be positioned to prevent and to minimize loss and damage. We should be able to work closely with local communities beyond the international forums, beyond the high-level conversations, and really bring solutions that are sustainable and that are actually very low cost compared to the billions of dollars that people ask on the table. Last but not least, it's people. And here, as you all know very well, we're still stuck in the development conundrum, which is primarily informed by the right to development, the right to industrialization, and the right to progress and prosperity. I fully agree with all that, and please don't take me wrong. But then, how do we put all this in the context of the climate crisis? How are you going to build a port if you know that sea level rise is going to impact its feasibility 20, 30 years ago? Or for example, as I was just discussing with the mayor of Marrakesh, they're building hotels all around, but then when I show him projections that 247 days by 2030 Marrakesh will have a temperature of more than 40 degrees, I was asking, where do you expect people to be during the rest of the year? What are the jobs that you're creating for your community and your cities? So how do we press forward and push for the right politics? How we anticipate, plan the right policies, and how do we transform the development, the adaptation, and the science in order to be able to have responses that are fit for a world that is very much in crisis. Thank you again.
Testing. Great. So each of you have mics in your chairs, and we're going to now enter into a conversation. So we really want to invite all of you in. In a few minutes, I'll invite people to walk up to the mic if you have questions or you want to make any short statements. And anyone who's online can certainly enter your comments and statements and questions in the chat. I'm going to start with kind of a maybe obvious question to some in the room, but maybe not so obvious to others, and that's really why would, say, researchers who are focused on managed retreat in North America or Europe, some other region in the world, why would groups or researchers need to be interested or concerned about what's going on in low-income countries? So I open it up to any one of you to speak to that issue. I think it just goes on.
Hello. I might be able to answer that as a person from the Global North, as a researcher from the Global North who has spent extensive time researching questions of habitability in the Global South, in Central America, as I mentioned, as in Bangladesh as well. The easy answer is that migration connects the planet, and that the problems of one group of people are the problems of everybody because of the connectedness of the planet through migration. You could say when northern Honduras goes underwater, this is not just northern Honduras's problem, it's central Honduras's problem. And it's also Guatemala's problem and Mexico's problem and everybody's problem because of the connectedness of the world through migration. So maybe that's just a first easy answer.
I think that's a brilliant answer, but I could just add to it, the question for me is why not? If you look at the world historically, even people in the West, they moved to Africa to bring people here forcefully. And now that we're experiencing the impact of climate change, a lot of people in the developing world impacted by climate change, they also want to come here. The question is, we're all connected. Number one, because of our shared humanity, but also because of the connections to climate that you mentioned. And if we even think within here in America, local issues, think about the wildfire that happened in Canada and how it got here to New York, and everybody was worried about the smog. We're all connected. It's a shared humanity, and so what happens in the global South should concern people in the global North, and particularly because the majority of emissions were essentially released by people in the global North, and so there is that shared, in this case, quite frankly, a higher sense of responsibility that I expect people and government in the global North to take seriously, to support people in the global South, and to take every issue that happened there, particularly in the context of climate change, very seriously, and provide resources for people to be able to adapt.
2 points to this question. One, I think why is it important? Because we need to reflect and agree what kind of society we're trying to build, what kind of future we're trying to put together. We have seen it, and I was quite surprised when I first arrived in the United States to face gated communities. People who live on their own, alone, and create a kind of ecosystem. Is that what we want for our children? Countries that are also becoming gated communities? And let me be clear, there will be countries within countries, communities, cities within cities. Is that what we want to build? And it starts, of course, trying to fend yourself from the South, global South, the countries that are in crisis, but it will end up also in your own cities, in your own neighborhoods, in your own estates. Whatever you will accept next door or will accept afar will reflect on you next door. That's point number one. Second, it is just because you need the global South. The raw material for any scientific progress or any economic progress are in the global South. And if there is instability, there will be increase in cost of living. If there is lack of adaptability, it will impact your productivity and your supply chain. And of course, if there is injustice, people will say no. So those are my answer. One is purely economic for the second point, and the second is pretty much what do we want from for our communities and for our societies in the future.
Great, thanks, Kamal, and thanks to each of you. How many geographers are in the house tonight? Raise your hand if you're a geographer. Wow, a lot. How about ecology? No ecologists, kind of a half-hearted hand raise over there. The next question is really for David, but any of you should feel free to answer. And where I'm going with this is that, habitability might stir up in some people's minds thoughts of environmental determinism, which has a kind of sordid history in geographic thought. It might also bring up notions of carrying capacity, which, ecologists ported conveniently over to human populations from cattle and zebras, and basically said how many people can a piece of land or an area support. And so what I want to ask David is what would distinguish habitability as a concept and what makes it useful, whereas these older concepts have been largely discredited by the academic community?
Okay, this is a good question, and maybe I can rely on Jola to help me back me up a little bit here. So I mentioned that we can reject this environmental deterministic vision of habitability because we know over time that vulnerability is socially constructed. It's a product of historical decisions that have led us to the position that we currently inhabit. This raises questions of power, of political economy, as I said. So beyond just habitability asks us to consider beyond questions of policy and management, but notions of power, marginality, and justice as well. So I would argue that these are central to a notion of habitability. I'll stop there and hope that Jola has something else to say about it. I don't know.
Well, when you said this was for David, I stopped thinking, but just a joke. I think what I think about goes back to what Kamal said in terms of, nations that could literally disappear if we don't do anything to address climate change. And so communities, islands that could disappear, and what would happen to not just those places we've known. We've seen history of collapse where places have been buried and they're now excavated and we find, oh yeah, they used to exist. And that's what I think about those places where, because of the impacts of climate change, they could literally fade out. And so thinking about Tuvalu or the Maldives or several other, small island nations and even communities there, and where would they be moving to? And if they were to move somewhere, whether within their region or even to the west, what sort of communities would they find in those places? Would they really feel a sense of not just the physical habitability? So if you're living a place that used to be a coastal location and you move to a place that is extremely hot, is it therefore habitable for you physically, but also culturally and socially as well? And so when I think about habitability, I think about what really makes a place a home for people and what's happening to people's homes that are disappearing, and what can we do as a collective, a collection of scholars and students and researchers and government to literally make new spaces that would be habitable for those who would be forced to move, because the reality is that some communities will be forced to move and some nations will literally disappear. So we need to start preparing for how to make new areas habitable for those communities. And these are the same people that have historically been marginalized. In many places, they are also people that are vulnerable. So we need to prepare to do something fundamental to support them.
Did you want to say something, Kamal?
I just want to go back to David's presentation. And it is quite important, to have clear definitions of habitability because of matrices, because of monitoring, because of policy, because of negotiations, etc. And that's definitely it's needed, because that's how we can earmark funds and be able to move forward. The second is from the example that you shared, where it was quite clear that habitability was part of identity, and that's something that you cannot quantify. You cannot put something on it. And it's what the 82 years old lady shared with you is what the people of Tuvalu share today, the mana, which is that connection they have to the sea, the connection they have to the land, the connection they have with their ancestors, something that is linked to where they live and how they live. And when they lose that sense of habitability and identity. So how, as we create a technical definition in order to advance the science, the politics, and the policy, we should not undermine the sense of heritage and identity that is close to many of those to be impacted and affected. Thanks.
Great. And I think one of the topics we'll be discussing in Thursday in those two sessions on habitability is how habitability is not just about environmental constraints or temperature thresholds or sea level rise or number of fire events, but it's also about it's socially constructed. So people make places habitable in a sense, but also loss of population can make places less habitable in some ways. So those are things that we want to discuss in those sessions. So turning a little bit to the policy space, then I want to invite people to come on up to the microphone if you have questions, and Jennifer's in the back. If you have any questions online or any comments, feel free to flag those for me. But in the migration space, I'd like to just have each of you think or reflect on what might make, what would be a transformative future? What would a transformative future look like in that space? And would there be global policies? Would there be local policies? What does this look like in terms of, we talked about Juneteenth and the Emancipation Proclamation and the fact that that was a truly transformative moment. What is it? What might be a transformative moment in this space? Any of you?
I can reflect on in the IPCC, we made a number of declarative statements about things we know about migration. And among those, we compiled them in one single place. And there was this really interesting set of statements to me that said a lot around the public and policy framing of migration as being a very important determinant of the success that migrants have in a host location. And so the way that we talk about migrants, the way that we think about migrants, the opportunities that we prepare for migrants, the housing needs that we meet, the healthcare needs, the educational needs that we meet are all dependent on our framing and our discourse around migration. And so it's very important that we understand that migrants are a net gain in almost every circumstance when they are prepared for, when they are invited. And so I would say the first step to making a more habitable world is changing our minds about migrants and preparing for them, welcoming them.
Anything else?
I can add, yeah. So the keyword you said, when they are invited. And that keyword is very important because there was a research that came out, I think about maybe a month ago, where it might even be from Colombia here, I'm not sure, some researchers, they mentioned that a lot of people are concerned about climate change, and they do recognize that people will move because of the impact of climate change. But when they asked people question about would you be willing to welcome a climate migrant, people were resistant and said no. And so because they feel climate migrants are not invited to come in, and that's where I think it's important for us not only to think about the policy spaces that need to change, but also the societal construction and discourses and thoughts and conversations around climate migration specifically. I think generally people sometimes are welcoming of economic migrants, whether people are coming from Latin America, Asia, or Africa. If it's economic migrant, they can immediately see the benefits to the country, and they support policies around that, especially even low-income migrants who they know can work in different sectors, in the hospital sector, in the food sector, in agricultural sector. It's fine, you can come in. But if you're coming in because you're being pushed by climate change, there has been that resistance, and that needs to change in the ways in which, people, generally the public,
is viewing climate migrant. And so the question becomes for all of us, how do we begin to work with people to change their understanding and the ways in which they think about receiving and supporting policies and plans to really move forward the idea of climate mobilities and particularly climate migration, and thinking about it through national federal policies to support climate migration, international policies for those working within the UN and other systems. We need a clear definitions, certainly, but also processes and funding and support to really aid climate migrants to get to areas of safety. And certainly locally in different cities where you work, in states, really getting states to also be involved in this conversation and creating policies and plans to support climate migrants. We don't have that yet, but I think we can make it happen. We can lobby people, we can advance that conversation that yes, climate migrants and climate mobility certainly deserves a set of policies to make this happen for people experiencing the impact of climate change.
2 points here, and I think there is definitely room for congratulation, because I remember when I started working on this in 2015, it was the Mediterranean refugee and migrant crisis, if you may remember, and that's when a shock happened in Europe, pushing for a solution beyond Europe, and which led to the process for the Global Compact for Migration and the Global Compact for Refugees. And at that moment, it was quite interesting to see that the countries did not foresee the nexus between climate change or climate crisis, forced displacement and migration. But what was quite interesting at the time is that the political discourse was one of walls and securitization of the climate and migration nexus. You may just remember Boris Johnson, just I think 2 years ago, he was claiming that climate change is going to displace people indeed in millions, and they're all going to end up on the shores of England or on the shores of Europe, and pretty much was used and abused by the extreme right, the populist, in order to undermine and denigrate further, the rights of people and migrants. So I think one aspect where we were able to, we succeeded, is to prove through science, through data, through the work that has been conducted, that primarily climate mobility, it's going to be internal. People do not want to leave the place they call home. And when they leave, they go next door. Why? Because there is that psychological dimension that I still can go back one day. Or I am not moving with my entire family, someone is behind and I can still go back. That element of circularity. So I am quite glad actually that including through that aspect, we were able to press forward the new nomenclature, which is climate mobility. It's literally 6-7 years old. It's not something that has been there for years. And this whole exercise started with Cancun in 2012. And as such, in such a short time, at least we were able to put to rest the use or the abuse by the extreme right, by the populist, those who wanted to undermine any effort by reinventing a response. Now, what is interesting is that we were able indeed to press a new narrative. We are able to tell a different story. We were able to bring data and science in this space in order to clarify how it impacts people. What we are still missing are the following. One is how to take that message from the policy and the political space to the people space in order very much to engage in conversations on how this impacts people and how it relates to people. So we don't make the mistakes of, as I mentioned earlier, going by global warming to the point my grandmother, when you speak about 1.5, she's like, I'm not concerned. Why should I care? Second, it's how this should transform our response. And here, response when it comes to what kind of development, which means how we should now have climate resilient development versus the previous approach to development. How do we reinvent protection? Because when people talk about refugees is a temporary protection system. What do you do with people who will require permanent protection through generations? People who are going to be forced to leave the place they call home and will have no home to go back to. Those who transformation of the human rights, including the human rights calendar, including the right to remain, and here to look at adaptation as a means to address the climate crisis and to help people, those who want to stay where they are, those who want to move, and those who are forced to move. But most importantly, it's to look at this exercise as a journey, because as you all know, some will have their livelihoods undermined and will need support when it comes to adjusting and adapting to the situations. Others will be forced to move. So how do you accompany that movement first to the village next door, to the city next door, to the bigger city? And last but not least, those who will be forced to leave their country or their continent in order to find refuge. And as such, we have to transform the way we approach humanitarian policies, protection policies, development policies, and justice policies. Over to you.
Great, thanks. I want to invite members of the audience, if there's anyone who would like to pose a question, to go ahead and take the microphone at the front. We are approaching the hour where we're going to have a nice drink at the back with some refreshments. Is there anything coming in online also, Jennifer? So I'm going to just close with one more question, then I think we'll wrap things up for tonight. And we've addressed this to some degree, but what level do you believe, each of you, that the best solutions will probably emerge? Is it likely to be at local, national, international, sort of UN level, or somewhere else? And will the policy lead or will society lead? Is it going to be kind of more top down or bottom up? And maybe we'll close with that very broad question, and then we can get on to the refreshments.
If I could start, I think that's an important question. I will address it by saying there are some changes we're seeing, especially when you're thinking about managed retreat specifically, and in some cases adaptation as well. And from the paper we did last year, we could tell that on success in managed retreat is the paper I'm referring to, that locally change does matter, and that people can come together as a community, sometimes work with NGOs, sometimes work with government, to really ensure effective and safe mobilities to a new location that would allow them to thrive or achieve their capabilities in some ways. So we can think about that as one of the core areas where change needs to happen or is happening. But to respond to your specific question, I think it has to happen on all levels, from the federal level to the states, down to the local government, and certainly internationally as well. The kinds of transformation that we need is not going to be limited to a specific level, even though I think we're seeing, different sets of changes happening to specific communities locally, where they get the resources to move, they get the knowledge, the capacity, the support they need, and it's happening, but it's in trickles. So if we want to see it in a robust and a more expansive level, we would need all levels of government, and we would need a multi-scaled and certainly a polycentric approach to the ways in which mobilities can be done, and certainly centering justice and equity, going back to the idea that for communities that choose to stay, they would need the support. For those that choose to move, those that are forced to move. And so on all levels, having different coordination come together and with different agencies that can support people would be important moving forward. So, yeah.
I agree with that change of all kinds at all levels is necessary. Radical action is necessary, but what we can do is right in front of us, that climate action is local action. I've been an observer at the UNFCCC and an author in the IPCC, and I was there when the previous administration attempted to pull us out of the Paris Climate Agreement. And it was really fascinating to watch the We're Still In movement occur, which was a collection of cities and institutions and private businesses that made an effort to articulate that we could still meet the obligations of the United States to Paris. And so it's interesting to note that the We're Still In movement was comprised of almost entirely local actors with local latitude to make change happen. And so I'm really, the city where we live in Corvallis, Oregon, just last fall, the city passed the Green New Deal, the Corvallis Green New Deal, which is a local policy statement which sets mostly kind of intentions. But what it does is signal things like a connection between climate action and housing, and climate action and inequality. And so I'm really motivated by these sorts of at least symbolic cultural changes at this point that can then, initiate more substantive changes that also have resources attached to them.
Great. Did you want to say anything, Kamal, to that?
It's a big dilemma, because I happen to be an optimist by necessity, but I just see ourselves in a train going into a wall and no one cares. We have been talking about this for 3-4 decades now, and the emissions just keep going up. We have been talking about the responsibility of countries and emitters, and the United States is still emitting much more than anyone before, and others are coming along. We have seen countries who are pushing this agenda, but still pumping oil and gas, and still pretty much including the champions. When it comes to negotiations on net zero, there's like always pushing it by 5 years or 8 years, or down, watering down the language and the commitment. I don't know. I just don't know. It's very sad, and it's Churchill said once, the only failure is to give up. So still pushing, but it's a tough one. And I don't know how this world is going to look like by 2050 and what we're going to leave behind to future generations as a heritage of our passage during these 2-3 generations. It's very sad, and we have to be frank about it. We really have to be frank, because if we are not, the mess is just building up.
Well, thank you, Kamal. I think that note of realism is needed, and also kind of speaks to the need, because at the global level, we seem to have such little action, the need for the kind of local action that David and Jola just highlighted. I want to just make 2 points before we close this session. That is that tomorrow evening we'll have an interactive session led by Susie Moser, known and beloved by many of you, and she will, along with a number of other people, be providing sort of a framework for exchange. So we really want to encourage all of you who are here in person to participate in that session. And then the next plenary will be on Thursday morning. So we purposely wanted to get as many parallel sessions on the agenda as possible. There were many more session proposals and then individual abstracts than we could handle if we had each day a plenary starting the day. So you will be starting tomorrow morning in your independent tracks and only in the evening coming together. So we're really looking forward to the program. Thank you all for coming. I want to thank our panelists for their wonderful presentations today. And with that, please go have some nice food.